Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I am very, very lucky to be joined this week by a fantastic author and an author who I know a lot of people have been really intrigued by her latest book. So I am joined by Liz Fenwick. Would you like to introduce yourself and say hello?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Liz Fenwick, and like Julia, I'm an American in England.
Mm-hmm.
And I write books set in Cornwall, and I don't know what else to say about myself.
Well, while we're talking about books set in Cornwall, so this is your latest. This is an advanced reader copy, so it's got something different on the cover here. You have the real version. Absolutely beautiful book, beautiful cover, and we're going to be talking about this book today because I had an early read of this back in I think March, April, and just thought it was an absolutely fantastic book and perfect for that dual timeline. Craving that I think so many readers have. So perhaps we can start by talking a little bit about what readers can expect when they pick up this book and the characters that they'll meet.
What can they expect? Well, houses.
Yeah. And gardens and
Gardens and houses. I have a thing about them, as you do.
I do, yeah.
And it's a book that explores what I really enjoyed about this book is that one of the main protagonists, Theo, is a woman in her 50s, and she's starting out on after a divorce, a messy one, a new life, and she impulsively buys a cottage, sight unseen, on the banks of the Tamar, entirely reckless. But it's a challenge that she is certainly up to, although she doubts it at times. And in the process of cleaning and finding and restoring, she finds a stash of letters. And they are from World War I, and most of them have been unopened. And she decides to find out who had lived in her cottage.
I love books that start with a stash of letters. I've written one myself because I think there's so much possibility there. And I loved the fact that this is an unopened group of letters. So obviously we're dealing with the past, we're dealing with unresolved issues in someone's story down the line. So obviously without bringing too much into it and spoiling what's going on in the book, could you tell us a little bit about that earlier timeline as well?
Certainly. The earlier timeline is about Lady Alice Neville, who is 18. She's a debutante. But it is true to say she was sent to school and was, shall we say, slightly radicalized there. And she is a suffragette and doesn't want the role that's in front of her. And she's strong-willed and impulsive. And again, it doesn't ruin the story. She decides to speak to the king and queen about the force feeding that was taking place of suffragettes at the time, and gets sent away to try and recoup the situation because she's a duke's daughter and she should be marrying well and not worrying about votes for women.
So interesting because you have these two women at very different transitions in their lives, but they are transitional points. So a woman coming out of a divorce, a woman who makes a choice in her literal coming out season, and it sends them on very different paths. What were those kind of themes that you were trying to tease out with these two women and in their transitional points? What were those stories that you wanted to tell?
Well, for Theo, I wanted her to discover that she didn't have to rely on other people's opinions of her. That, that she was strong enough, and, she'd been put upon the whole of her life thinking that she hadn't achieved enough. She comes from an academic family. She's not academic. And what I wanted her to discover, and the themes I wanted, was self-belief. And with Alice, she had self-belief, but she was what I really found fascinating in looking at Alice's life in particular is how tightly bound she was. Here she had all the privilege in the world, a duke's daughter. The world should be at her feet, and they were, because she was beautiful, she was bright, etc. And yet she was so limited in what she was able to do. at that time. And I just found that a really fascinating contrast between Theo, who is a little bit younger than I am, what she experienced, you know, having fallen into her marriage, and what became of her through that. And Alice, who has to find a way to be true to herself. I think it's being true to yourself.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Theo, in theory, does everything that you should do in order to have, you know, the security of a good marriage and kids, and she has the beautiful home that she redoes, and it sounds fabulous. I want to go to this place.
Yes.
And these gardens, and at the same time, Lady Alice is sort of forsaking all of those things, but again, it doesn't give them necessarily the obvious path that people would expect for women in either time and in either situation.
Completely. Both of them, well, I mean, Theo becomes a rebel at the age of 54, and Alice was the rebel at the age of 18. Mm-hmm. And it's just interesting to see how their stories overlap and contrast and vary. I really liked looking at the two women and comparing the journeys that they took.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because they, on the surface, very, very different people, but you can really pull through those threads and those things that they share together as characters. It's a wonderful book in terms of mirroring experience and mirroring personality, I think. Mm. I think nobody can speak to you about one of your books without talking about the very, very real character that is place, and not just houses, but also the area of England that you're writing about. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, it's pronounced the Tamar, is that correct?
Yeah, the Tamar.
I should know this, but I should be more confident about this.
It was interesting because where I live in Cornwall is down on the Lizard. So quite a, you know, it takes me 2 hours to get to the Tamar, but yet it always fascinated me because it's almost a complete border. I think there's 6 miles that the Tamar doesn't define the border between Devon and Cornwall, and the fact that it is such, you know, forgetting the cream tea issue, you know, jam first or cream first. Yes. There is a real defined sense of people from Devon and people from Cornwall, and that they are different. And yet at times the river itself is not very wide, mm-hmm. but yet it is huge in people's imagination. And it is a real divide. So I just found it fascinating to explore that and to learn more about the Tamar. I mean, the research you do, most of it never goes in the book, but I remember reading a book on the industrial heritage of the Tamar. Now, I'm not really dealing with any of that, mm-hmm. but it was important for me to understand the difference between, there are 2 estates in the book. There is Abbotswood, and then there's Penhale, which is at the more industrial side. Not that it's hugely industrial, of the river. And it was interesting to see the difference.
And it's interesting also because you have real moments of crossing over in this book, because you are going from bank to bank. You know, characters are making decisions and taking actions, and in a lot of cases, literally rowing boats over this river, because you get the impression that you do have to drive or walk or ride quite a ways in order to make a crossing. So there's something very intentional, I think, about that as well, in placing that right in the center of this narrative.
It was very intentional. There's no question about it. And the fact that, particularly at Abbotswood, when you cross the river, it's wild. It's not really developed aside from this boatman's cottage. There is nothing there. What was the place that it's based on, Hotel Ensley, was built by the Dukes of Bedford in 1815. And they altered the landscape on the Cornish side slightly to look more like Scotland. Mm. So it's densely wooded and it feels very other. Whereas when you cross or you look up at the hunting lodge, there is a sense of grooming about it. And I mean, that obviously plays into Humphrey Repton, who designed the landscape and wanted it to look natural, but to create the feelings that you feel as you go through it.
I find landscape gardening so fascinating when the idea is to be natural, but also very intentional. Everything is placed exactly where they want it to be. And there's this sort of tricking of the viewer as you look out over this landscape and think, this is so beautiful and wild and natural. And there's not a natural thing about it, actually. It's
Yes.
all very carefully managed, very carefully planned.
Well, it was one of the last gardens that he designed. In fact, it may have been his last. And it's why there is the long border there, because when he was doing it, he was being carried around in a chair. And he always felt that flowers as such were for the young and the old. And he said, I'm now old.
And so he built that into his garden design.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. I would love to hear a little bit more about the boatsman's cottage, because I think that might be a fantasy that certainly every expat has had, that you go off somewhere, you purchase a property that's falling down, and you systematically put it back together again, and it's wonderful and it has its challenges, but there is this real sense of sort of accomplishment and connection with the past and the area itself, which I think is what you get in this book, even though she's not an expat. This is just me projecting. But that cottage, where did the idea of a place that was literally tumbling down come from?
From real life, as it turns out. I looked, where the story came from is we took an offer of 2 nights for 3 in January to stay at Hotel Ensley. And my husband was working in London at the time, and I picked him up from a train station, probably Bodmin Parkway, plugged in the postcode, and needless to say, the sat-nav took possibly the most direct route, but the most obscure route to get to it. And in the middle of the January mist and murk that was so deep, we ended up on Horsebridge, which was built in 1837. And as we're crossing this medieval ancient stone bridge with all the fog and everything else that was around it, current day was erased. You could not see anything modern. And I sat there in the car and I thought, oh my God, this story's here, this story's here. And then we took the 10 minutes to get to the hotel, and we walked in, and it's the most beautiful reception hall with wood paneling and this massive table in the center with this glorious floral display and an open fireplace that was roaring. And I sound mad when I say it, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw a First World War officer just kind of there. And I thought, oh, there's definitely stories here. And we walked into the library and I looked down, and, it was very murky, but you look down and there is the Tamar, and it's quite swollen at that point in January. And then the hillside rises up, and I looked at a map a little bit later, and on the other side, it marked Boatman's Cottage. I'm thinking, I didn't see anything there. And then you read the history. And when they designed the estate, the Duke liked to see wood smoke rising from the Cornish bank. So this Boatman's Cottage was built so that there was a fire continuously going, and wood smoke rose above the trees, absolutely. And I thought,
that's mad. I love it.
And then I was out with Chris and my husband, and I was walking the Tamar and looking, Chris, do you see anything over there? What's there? Does it still exist? And I spoke to the head gardener and I said, is the cottage still there? And he said, yes. And he was able to point it out to me. There's not much of it left. It's the wall with the big fireplace in it, and a bit of the front wall and a bit of the other gable wall that's left. So that gave me full license to create a cottage that I felt that would have been there based on what the rest of the estate was like, because it was all built in the cottage ornate style. So I knew it would have had a few quirks and things like that. So it was tremendous fun.
Well, it's wonderful too, because you can base things in real life and get the real texture and feel, but then you have the license to do with what you will in terms of, the actual, what you need for your narrative.
Yes.
I think that's always a lovely way to go about historical fiction, a blend of the real and the fictional. Absolutely.
There's no question about that.
So you've spoken about the inspiration for some of the physical place and the stories there. And obviously, you mentioned the World War I soldier out of the corner of your eye. How did the suffragette storyline come into play? What was the inspiration there?
I think, if I'm honest, I hadn't realized it was going to be a part, but one of the things I do for research, particularly with the historical aspect, is I like to look at paintings, portraits done at the time. And I was in the National Portrait Gallery, and there's a beautiful painting, or there was at the time, of Emily Pankhurst's daughter in sort of evening gown with the suffragette sash on. And I hadn't really thought about it. I was struck by the beauty of the portrait. I took a photo of it and it stayed in my mind. But when I was writing the story, I didn't know it was going to play a role. I simply knew that there was going to be a forbidden love affair. And then when it suddenly came out, all the pieces began. I think, oh, well, yes, this is exactly the right time for her to be involved and to be passionate about it.
That makes, so it makes sense. You fit the character to the need of the story in some ways.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I knew she was headstrong. I knew everything else. So as you start developing her as a person, as she really begins to come off the page, you think, well, actually, she would be passionate about this. You know, the more you delve into the time, you think, what would they be interested in? What would be at their heart? Is she more concerned about what dresses she'd be wearing, or is she more aware of the world that's going on? Because 1914 was the most amazing year. There was so much change and so much going on that it was great fun to research that.
Well, and I suppose if you're looking for a character who is a young woman who's also a rebel, that's a perfect thing for her to be interested in, because it really was not societally acceptable for these young women. And literally, you know, she is essentially sent into exile for the action she takes in support of the cause. So it seems perfect, actually, that she would be involved in this cause. We have a question from somebody who's interested in sort of the writing of this book and the whole narrative. So Dorothy says, this book was compared to Kate Morton's novels, which I love. Did you write each story and then go back and weave them together?
I wrote a really raw draft with the stories intertwined at the start, and my editor read that draft and she said the historical isn't good enough. And at that point I then separated the stories and wrote Lady Alice's story start to finish, and then reintegrated it with the modern day story.
What do you think it was about separating that out that helped you with that historical piece?
I think it actually wasn't the history. That was fine. It was the character. Without breaking into thinking about Theo's journey, to just purely focus on Alice's journey, it came alive. It really opened up and came alive, and it was much more successful. But I'm quite pleased that I wrote the first draft, which gave me the structure of the book for the most part. As a whole. Also, no, it was just one of the things. I, in the past, have done a lot more interweaving of chapters, but at the start of this book, the first part is all Theo, and the second part is all Alice. And I think that works better for this particular story, because the reader has a chance to be grounded in both.
Sure. Before
we're careening off.
And I think it's an interesting lesson to people who may be watching and, you know, maybe writing or interested in writing themselves, that it doesn't always work on the first draft. Sometimes these things need to be reworked in terms of structure and character and all of those things. You do need to focus down on what the problems are once you've actually gotten at least some of the book out on paper.
I think that's a huge thing. I mean, no book is ever the same. And for this book, the first draft came in at only 86,000 words. So it was very slim in the sense of the story that was told. The next draft came in at 130,000 words. And I was told the historical worked, but the modern day didn't, which was the reverse of what I'd been told with the first edit. So I then went in and cut 40,000 words and made the story fall together in a better manner.
Do you find the process of cutting away to be difficult, or do you like the editing process?
I actually don't mind it. I think this last edit, it was brutal. The letter that came, and I had to go away and mourn because I knew what she was saying. In the end, I had two different stories, and I had to decide which story I wanted to tell more. And so I had to sacrifice part of Theo's story to make it more of a frame for Alice's story. But once I started doing that, I quite enjoyed the process because I could see the book opening up and coming alive.
It's funny, I've tried sometimes to describe what I really enjoy about the editing process to people, because I do love editing. I think it's, as you say, it's the moment that the book comes alive and it reveals itself to you. And whether that's adding in detail or creating entirely new characters, which happens sometimes.
Yes.
It's almost as though you can sit down and finally kind of breathe and say, okay, this is what this book actually needs. But it's very difficult sometimes to articulate that to somebody who hasn't gone through that process before. I think it's a very unique thing to being an author.
I do think it is. I mean, the closest I can think of it is my rough draft is like a block of stone. And with editing, I'm like a sculptor going in and finding whatever it is I'm sculpting within that. That's the only comparison I can think of.
I like that analogy a lot. I think that makes sense. Again, it's sort of, there's something in there.
Yes.
Sometimes it's more obvious than others. And some books you end up completely reworking everything. And I've had those books as well. But in the end, it's very satisfying to see that final product on the page.
It is, and it takes a while also to get the distance to be able to see it, even when you've done all the edits and you've done the proof pages and the final book comes to you. It's still, I don't know, sometimes I still can't see it.
Yeah, it's a strange feeling, but one that I think is pretty shared by a lot of authors.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, you mentioned earlier that you are an expat as well, and I'm curious about how that maybe does or doesn't affect your writing, whether it's, the actual act of writing or sort of your perspective on things and your way of looking at the world. Do you think that it comes to bear on your books?
I think it comes to bear on my books, and I think that it's very good for writers to be strangers or outsiders, because it means that we look at things more closely. And by just being that little bit away from everything that's happening, because it's new, it's different, you notice it. So I think you pick it up more easily to explain it to other people in the process of writing. So I think being an expat or a stranger is a huge advantage. I think probably one of the funniest things that happened to me is, up until the last two books, I hadn't been published in the US. And editors over there kept saying, her books are too English. I'm thinking,
I mean, it's a compliment in a weird sort of way.
Yes.
It's tricky, I think. It's tricky establishing that balance between, is your primary publisher based in the UK or is your primary publisher based in North America? And between the US and Canada, there are going to be some subtle differences as well. It's very hard, I think, pleasing everybody. So you do, I think, just have to settle on who bought the book? Who bought the book first?
Who bought the book first? Yes.
Who am I making happy here? And I know for me, it comes up most often, I think, in copy edits. It's a question of language. It's a question of, vocabulary. I've trained myself out of certain things. For instance, I think in The Light Over London, I wrote sidewalk rather than pavement once. And for the character I was writing, they were a British person and I should have said pavement. But there's these subtle little things that don't pop up unless somebody reads it who is familiar with those things and can pull them out. And I don't know about you, but I now am a bit of a mess. I'm never entirely sure what the American versus the British of anything is.
Exactly.
So
I have a friend who reads normally the early copy, and she pulls out my Americanisms, because I'm thinking I haven't put any in there, and she manages to find them.
Exactly. And you've moved several times. This is not just a move from the US to the UK. You've lived in a lot of different places. Am I right?
Yes, I have lived in Dubai, Indonesia, Moscow, Calgary, and in Houston, which felt very different from where I grew up in Boston. It could be a different world in many ways.
And so in some ways, I imagine you're
So it
drawing.
gives you a different.
Oh, pardon me. I think we've got a little bit of a delay. Go ahead.
No, you.
Oh, I was just going to say, I imagine you are drawing on all of these places, and all of that comes into play when you're writing, because things are being filtered through your perspective, but it also can make it somewhat challenging sometimes for some of those very close language moments.
The language moments are extraordinary. And don't you also find it in historical, especially with Lady Alice? I was continually checking myself, what was the terminology used then? What was, was this in play? All sorts of things. And it came up the other night at dinner. Somebody was saying about their father. Their mother had said they were, and I'm trying to think, I can think of the phrase, but I can't think of the initials that are used, not safe in taxis, which was frequently said about certain people when you were a debutante.
Yes.
You would definitely not, and you use the initials for it and stuff like that. And I think I've encountered that quite a few times. But when I first encountered it, I hadn't realized it was something that was in play, back in in 1914.
Well, and it's something that actually I've put into my book that comes out in December, because that term was being used in 1958 when women were debutantes, and the idea of who do you feel comfortable letting your daughter get into a taxi with, or who does the daughter feel comfortable getting into a taxi with, and in some cases, not a chance.
No.
How do you do?
Well, sometimes they grab the chance.
Well, exactly, and that's the problem. How do you do the research into sort of some of that different terminology? And because I find that I pick it up in bits and pieces. There's sort of no good way that I've found of trying to really sort of get into that voice other than reading a lot. I don't know if you have another approach.
No, I tend to try and read fiction that was published at the time, and biographies. And then what I found tremendously useful, of course, was going through the old magazines, Tatler, Bystander, and so forth. You could, the language used in that was fantastic. In fact, I had my daughter rolling around on her sides when I read out one of the quotes that the photographer jumped from the bush and yelled and ejaculated stop or something. You're just thinking, the fact that he jumped from the bush and ejaculated, you're just
quite
thinking,
something. It's an image.
So some of those things we avoid.
Yes. I imagine to modern ears, those are, or modern eyes, that would be a bit, that'd be enough to pull you out of the story, shall we say.
Definitely. But I did find the magazines most useful for the language of the day. What about you?
I think I take somewhat of a similar approach. I try to lean on oral histories where there are any. And I think as you go further and further back, it becomes a bit more difficult to not only access that, but also access women's stories. Because in a lot of cases, people didn't think that they were significant enough to record. And it's such a shame. Diaries, I think, are a great resource that I've used before. But again, it's sort of getting the right thing, getting the right resource for the right character. So there are some instances where I'm sure, in Cornwall, there's specific terminology, specific ways that people would have spoken about the land. Every region has its own vocabulary as well. So that's a second layer on top of all the historical research that you're doing too.
And then class.
And class is a big one as well. And there is still so much variation in accent and terminology if you move across classes in the UK now. And I can only imagine that was more so when the class system was even more stratified.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
When you were trying to do some of the research around the regional side of things, were you also drawing on local publications and resources, or is it more secondary material at that point?
It's more secondary. The one thing that I did draw on, that again wasn't used, because the book, although the letters come back from the front, there's no scenes per se from the battlefields, but I read the complete annals of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry from 1914 to 1918. Wow. Well, I had to know exactly what regiment, what battalion, where they were, where the letters were coming from. And again, that's not necessarily referenced in the story, but for me, that was important. And I think that also gave me a very good feel for where people were coming from and some of the letters that were written home and that sort of thing. That was important.
Yeah, I can imagine. It helps build out the time and the place and, you know, what would have happened to characters in certain situations.
Yes.
I find the regimental and military side of research the most challenging in some ways, because there is so much specialist knowledge.
Yes.
And there are so many things that you can get wrong, and so many people who have incredible detailed memories of all the research that they've read over the years because they're just interested in it. So you want to try to avoid that dreaded email that says, actually.
Yes, I think that's maybe why I didn't do anything that was actually on the front.
I've avoided that as well for the most part due to similar issues. So I'm curious about, we always think of historical fiction as being heavy on the research side for the historical timelines and those stories, but what about the present day? Were there any things in particular that you felt you really needed to do a deep dive into in order to bring those to life for Theo and your characters in the modern era?
Well, fortunately, I have renovated a historical house, not a falling apart one, but I am intimately knowledgeable of woodworm and all the effects thereof, because the house I'm standing in right now suffers from it quite substantially. I've used gardens in previous novels, so I was able to draw on that quite substantially. But my mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, had exhibited at Chelsea her garden designs. So I called on that sort of knowledge. And I also spoke to the florist who works at Ensley, and she actually had lived there before it became Hotel Ensley, and drew upon the history and also her knowledge of flowers and so forth.
And I have to ask, because we have this mutual love of flowers, was there anything in particular that you put into this book for sentimental reasons when it came to your, speaking of gardens and floral design?
Well, Theo's garden itself was pretty challenging for me because it is a woodland garden. So I had to do a fair bit of research on what would actually grow in a woodland garden. But what did I put in? Well, there were always roses because I'm passionate about roses. They say you can't grow them in Cornwall. I have 60 different roses in my garden, and my garden's not that big.
They're really packed in there.
Yes. I'm now desperately trying to remember the book because there's a lot of flowers in there.
You know, I've had the same moment. You know, people have said to me, oh, it would be so wonderful if you could do a guide to all the flowers that were in the last garden in England. I keep thinking to myself, that would require me rereading the book and trying to figure out what I put in there. And unfortunately, I just don't have the time. A couple things I did very specifically because there's sentimental reason behind it. You know, I associate it with one of my parents, or it's, you know, from a garden that we had growing up. But some of it was literally opening up books of borders, looking at them and thinking, okay, this is going to be the model upon which I build this garden that I'm creating out of thin air that doesn't exist.
It's great fun doing that, though. I mean, but like you, I can't recall, and the nearest I've come is I've listened to the first half of the book on audio because I wanted to see how good or bad the narrator was. As it turns out, she's done a fabulous job, and I thought, oh wow, this is really good. She's got those voices, great.
I was going to say, what is the experience, because I don't listen to my books on audio, but a couple of people who've been guests have said it's actually a great way to prepare for your book tour because you're so far into the next book by the time you're preparing for whatever interviews you're coming up on. It's a great way of refreshing. How do you find the experience of listening to your own words read back to you?
I couldn't do it on the Cornish House. Possibly I started it, and there's a very stroppy teenager of 15 in there, and I felt the narrator laid it on too thickly. It was a case of what she said was bad enough, but if you put the attitude in the voice, I found I couldn't listen to more than the first chapter. That was the end of that. Having said that, she then narrated several of the other books, and she did an absolutely brilliant job. Mm-hmm. But I also have to say, the Returning Tide, they didn't ask me how you pronounce things.
I see.
And each chapter there is where it's located. And one of the key locations is a place called Monan Smith.
Monan Smith.
And she pronounced it Maunan.
Oh.
About 150 times.
Oh, that's really unfortunate.
It was, and it was brought to my attention by a local person who listens to it. She's a seamstress, and she listens to audiobooks all the time. And I therefore listened to the whole book. And she had me in tears at the end because she had mastered the voices of the people, and it all came alive. But every time she said the place name, and again, it's the Cornish place names. If they don't talk to you, they may get it wrong. In my last one, mentioning Foy, calling it Fowie. And things like that, and you wouldn't know, and it, all as it is a simple thing to find it out. But I do tend to listen to them to see how they've done. But I also listen to my work as an editorial tool.
Really? Now, how do you go about doing that?
I now work on Apple, so it's built-in software. But when I was working on PCs, I had I think it's called Natural Voice, and it's text to speech. And when I first did it, it was Microsoft Sam's voice, which is absolutely ghastly. There's no emotion in it. But I'm dyslexic, and it is a great way to edit, and because my ear is far better than my eyes. So I listen to my books at least 3 times in the process of working on them.
That's so interesting. I've never done that before. And again, I've heard of people doing this, but it's interesting to me that it's not just a typo check for you. It sounds like it's part of the actual process of developing the book.
It is, because you hear the rhythm of the sentences. You hear the disconnects if you haven't got a transition in there that should be in there, because the computer has no way of knowing. Whereas a narrator, an actor reading it, can put in things that aren't necessarily on the page or are implied on the page, but the computer can't. So it's great editorial technique.
Oh, that's wonderful. I might use that actually. I'm intrigued by it. I've tried to do a couple things around dictation, but that's a very different skill set and a very different result in some cases as well. Unfortunately, I've never put in the time and the effort to really train a dictation software to my voice and my cadence of speaking. But I do know some people who use it with great success. But again, it sounds like that's a different part of the process.
I have tried it. I broke my wrist, and I'm left-handed, and broke my left wrist, and I tried it at that point, and it just didn't work for me. No. I think through my fingers.
I think I do as well. There's almost like an opening up.
Yes.
And it's difficult to describe to people other than authors, but it's almost like you sort of shut down your active brain in some ways and just start writing, which I think is one of the reasons it can be so difficult to translate how to write to somebody else. You can work on different skills and different parts of craft, but I have a very difficult time articulating how I actually sit down and write a book, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
No, but if you, it's particularly good. It takes a while to listen, because it's not like an audiobook that's 10, 12 hours, because you'll possibly go back and listen. If things suddenly jar and you're kind of, well, wait a second, that doesn't work. So you'll go back and re-listen. But if I have a really tight turnaround and I haven't got time to put the script away for a couple of days even, listening to it gives you that distance. because you use a different part of the mind.
Sure. That's fascinating. I might have to give that a go on the next book.
Try it on a chapter.
Yes, I think one chapter first, and then we'll go from there and see how that goes. I would love to get a chance to talk to you a little bit about your writing community, partially because whenever we do interviews like this, people are always curious about, writers supporting other writers, but also because just before this came up live, your friend of mine popped up and gave a little wave. And so, I know that you have a very strong group of, I don't know if you call them critique partners or writing partners, and you do retreats. Can you tell us a little bit about what that does for your writing process and how that has been for your writing career throughout the years?
Bridget, who is the person that popped up on the screen, is part of what I call my blessings. There are two. There's Bridget Cody and Deborah Harkness. And the book is actually dedicated to both of them because this book wouldn't be what it is without their input. What we do for each other is we all write very different things. So Deborah Harkness wrote The Discovery of Witches, and she's also a professor of history of science. So try writing historical fiction when the person reading it is a professor of history. Oh my God, talk about fear. But also she was a tremendous help when it came to that. We do eventually share work and comment, but a lot of the time it's just cheerleading and Bridget is brilliant at brainstorming. And I use her. None of my books would have been written if I couldn't have brainstormed, what about this? What about that? And she said, yes, if you go this way or you go that way, and just throwing out ideas. Deb offers really insightful read-throughs and challenges me always to be a better writer and so forth. So we all offer different things. We do retreats when we're allowed, or boot camps, as we call it. We try and work a pretty tight ship in that sense, that we come down, we write, you may breakfast. We will always go out on a plot walk. A plot walk is my absolute thing. I think
is that where you're wandering and then also talking out whatever issue?
Not necessarily. I just think the whole act of walking is such an important part of my writing process and many writing process. It's also really good for the biggest problem of being a writer, which is writer's bottom. And
yes, there is some spread that happens if you're not careful.
Yes, it very easily, especially in lockdown. But it was what writing and walking does. Many times you go out specifically with a blank mind, and just having an open sky in front of you and the repetition, suddenly things will start shaking up in your brain, and those little bits that you couldn't quite make work suddenly pop together, and you suddenly stop, grab your phone, dictate or type yourself an email, and you've solved a problem. Other times you can go out with a specific problem in mind. I remember it was at the near the literally the final moments to hand in the final version of The Path to the Sea, and I still felt something was missing. The editor said it was all fine, but I knew something wasn't right. And I was out, Biddy was down for that week, Bridget, and we were walking every day, and every walk I was like, what does Lottie want? What does Lottie want? In fact, I was a lot ruder about it, what I was saying. And I spent a full 4 days wondering what she wants. And my husband was working in London at the time. He walked through the door on the Friday night. It hit me. And I'm like, don't talk to me. Don't talk to me. Finally figured out what she wanted. And I think it made a much better book for it. But I think the whole process of walking and just being in nature, if possible, really enhances it, because so much of writing is not writing.
It's true. It's all of the subconscious work that goes on behind the scenes and things that get worked through. I find that when I'm actively trying to work through a problem, I often end up against a brick wall, and it will be something mundane, washing the dishes, blow drying, ironing something repetitive where you can't you can't be in front of your laptop. You can't really be dictating. It's just something about having that sort of empty mind space. And for me, really, blow drying my hair is the big one.
Okay.
Because literally, you can't listen to anything. You can't do it. It really does help.
Taking a bath.
Yes.
Just soaking in the tub. Things fall together. It makes such a huge difference. So as a writers community, that's what we do. We are the support team. We talk each other off the cliff when we get there. Biddy knows every stage of my writing. We'll get on and I'm like, oh my God, this book is absolute crap. I'm never going to write another book. And she said, oh, are we at 45,000 words by any chance? And it's like, yes. And she said, okay, on time, tick.
Like, great, you're right in where you need to be in your process. It's fine.
Yes.
What were you doing? I know you said when you're able to get together, you try to go on these boot camps together. What were you doing to sort of fill that gap during the pandemic when restrictions were in place?
Well, it depends on when Deb is out in California, which she is frequently. Biddy and we would meet, I think it was about 5 o'clock our time and morning her time. And we just have a quick catch up Monday through Friday. And when she's on our own time, then we're a little bit more flexible on what we do. And one of the things from boot camp that was really important is come between 5 and 6, the ritual was dry sherry and salami. Pork product.
Very civilized.
And so we kind of, if we're on the right schedule, we'll do that on a Friday night together. We'll have the glass of sherry and some salami or something along those lines, and just talk about life in general, less about writing.
I think there's something nice about having that community of people around you. I know when I've done writing retreats, it's been sort of, there's a morning session, there's an afternoon session, and then usually there's the brainstorming, marketing, plotting, whatever is needed, and whiskey after a very sort of leisurely dinner. And there is something nice about, sometimes it's very focused on writing because you share this experience, you're in the business together, and sometimes it's just, whatever is on your minds, and all of that is good. It all feeds into that sort of sense of these people who know you really well.
I think it's the sense of being with other writers who understand that there's always stuff going on in your head. It never shuts off. Even when you're blow drying your hair, it doesn't shut off clearly if you get your ideas in.
No, you're right. It's a unique challenge, but it seems to work. So
yeah, it's good fun.
I would love to hear a little bit about what you are reading right now, or what you have been enjoying reading recently, and anything that you would recommend to people.
My book of the year thus far is one that came out on the same day as mine last week. It's Louise Beach's This Is How We Are Human. And it takes your breath away. It is stunning. And it's uncomfortable at times. And that's not normally my go-to, if you will. But the writing is so beautiful. And the story is, there's a mother and her son is autistic. I think it's autistic. And he's 20 years old and he's desperate to have sex. Normal bodily function, but people make fun of him. They don't get him. And yet he's beautiful and so forth. So she decides that she's going to hire a prostitute. And it's the journey of the three of them together. And it is stunning. I can't recommend it enough.
Really?
It just took my breath away. And as I say, it's not what I would normally go for. I mean, I love historical fiction. That's my normal, if I want something, that's where I'm going to go linger in. But I cannot recommend This Is How We Are Human enough.
Oh, wonderful. It's one that I don't know. And again, I probably wouldn't necessarily naturally think, oh, I'll go. So I also default to historical fiction and mystery typically, especially when I'm trying to write a book. Sometimes I need a little distance from historical fiction.
Exactly.
But that is a really wonderful endorsement. So
I'm just trying to think if the proof is lying somewhere in the piles that are behind me, that I can show you the cover, because it's a wonderful cover. You've got a snow globe on the front of it. It's a good thing you can't see the study.
I was going to say, this is like what you can't see beyond this. There's stacked books absolutely everywhere at the moment. So
I can't find it. It must not be in this room. But yeah, that is that. I also read another book that's coming up that is historic fiction, dual timeline, Nicola Cornick's The Last Daughter, I think is what it's called here in the UK. And in the US, it comes out as The Last Daughter of York.
I think that's right. I just requested that on NetGalley. It looks wonderful. And she has been recommended to me so many times by so many people. She really is talented.
Yeah, no, great book. And I'm just starting another historical that's due out by Sarah Sheridan. And it's set in Edinburgh. And it's about botanists. And I can't think of the title. Isn't that awful?
Look that up. You know, it happens. And I imagine if you're reading copies early also, sometimes they're not immediately, because the people aren't speaking about them as readily as, you know, books that have just come out. So, oh, wonderful. Well, these are good recommendations. I'll have to keep an eye out for. Anything Edinburgh, it's close to my family's heart, since I have a Scottish brother-in-law, who is from Edinburgh, and that's where my sister, he and my sister met. So.
Oh, wonderful. University or?
No, it was completely, I'll have to have him on one day to tell the story, but it was completely chance. She was traveling and he was working and living in Edinburgh, and they met and had, 6 hours over drinks together. And then she, yelled her name at him as she was running, back to her hotel. And he found her on Facebook, and they were married several years after that. So it's one of those wonderful international love stories. There's details to fill in between there, but again, I'll have to get them to tell the story at some point. It's very sweet.
Oh, I bet it is.
I would love to hear a little bit, if you were able to tell us before we go, about your next book or what you're working on right now, if there's any detail you can share.
Oh, yeah. The next book is set in the Halford. It's set in World War II. And it deals with the SOE, the secret flotillas that used to leave from the Halford to Brittany. That's pretty much the broad strokes of it. But again, it's one of the things that I have a character in mind. And I, had sketched out, I always knew she was something. And then, oh, boom, it just takes off. And the more research you do into that, you think, oh, actually, this could be really interesting, and not in the direction I thought it was going.
Interesting. That is an area of history that I don't know a huge amount about. Obviously, World War II, I've spent some time in, but there's so many stories to be told. From British experiences across the war and across the country. So I'm very intrigued.
It's great. And one of the nice things about it is I was able to interview the son and daughter of one of the men who did go across, and the current owners of the house that was the headquarters. So it's kind of, when it's this local, you can still put your hand on people that less and less remember, but have connection to it.
And the family stories, I imagine, are passed down, and so there's some oral history record there.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! Well, I'm very intrigued by this. Do you have a name yet, or?
My working title is The Map of You, but that we'll see.
Titles change. I don't think I've ever had a title in historical fiction that hasn't changed at some point during the process. So.
Most of my titles have changed along the way. I mean, the Cornish house was a Cornish house, so that wasn't a big change, but all the others have changed radically. But I think for once, I really feel The River Between Us is the right title that we eventually got to.
It's such a wonderful title. It's so evocative of the story and again of the place and the different timelines, and I just love it, and it's an absolutely fantastic book. So I'm very, very excited for people to read it, because I want more people to talk to about it, especially in this group. So Wonderful. Well, where can people find you online if they want to follow along and learn more about this book, the next book?
I am on Twitter as Liz_Fenwick or Fenwick, and I am on Instagram the same. And Instagram is, although recently it's been about book, is mostly about the views from my study window and my plot walks. So it's mostly Cornish scenery. And I have an author page on Facebook, and lizfenwick.com is the other place.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending the time and telling us a little bit about The River Between Us. And I think that this book is just wonderful. I'm so excited for people to read it. So thank you. And I hope we'll be talking to you again sometime soon.
That would be great. Thank you.